Hello, and welcome to Raising the Bar with the MBBA. I am Jason Clark, president of the Metropolitan Black Bar Association, along with our co-host, Adeola Adejobi. So for those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, the Metropolitan Black Bar Association is the largest association of predominantly African American attorneys in New York. Our goal is to advance equality in the pursuit of justice, assist in the professional development of our members, and address legal issues affecting New Yorkers. The purpose of Raising the Bar with the MBBA is to foster a deeper conversation about justice issues in our community and to try to identify a couple of solutions in the process. Today, we're going to take a deeper dive into civil rights and more specifically, what to do if you're stopped by a police officer. Let's discuss. So joining me now is the co-chair for the Legislative Committee for the MBBA, Asha Smith.
Thank you for having me.
Please, thank you. And from the law office of Philip Hamilton, Mr. Philip Hamilton himself.
Thank you for having me as well.
Mm-hmm. And let's get to it. So we're going to start this a little dry, a little different. So first, we're going to talk about the issue of the right to remain silent. So under the Fifth Amendment, and bear with me, it says that no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment of an indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in land or naval forces or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger, nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in a criminal case to be a witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process, nor shall private property be taken for the public use without just compensation. So what does that mean?
Right.
Asha,
what does that mean?
What does that actually mean, and what does that say in real things?
But I think that we probably want to focus on the part where that Fifth Amendment is talking about no one should be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself or herself, as it is now. And that's basically what the right to remain silent means, that you have a right not to incriminate yourself against any charges that you might be facing.
And, you know, even more so than that, about 6 years ago, there was a Supreme Court case. It was entitled Salinas v. Texas, all right? And interestingly, within that case, Justice Alito kind of qualified when exactly the right to remain silent attaches, okay? It's not something that's actually universal, at least as what the court put down within that case. The right is something that attaches when you are subject, not to use too much legalese, to custodial interrogation, which means you are in the custody of the police and you are in the process of being interrogated by the police. What happened within that case was there was a situation where the police wanted to speak with a particular individual, Mr. Salinas, about a crime that had happened. They were in the process of investigating it. He went down to the precinct voluntarily. He was in the process of speaking with them just about general pedigree information that he had. When they asked him a question that reached a point within his mind that he felt if he answered would put him in a position where he may be looked upon as guilty or he may have been looked upon as having to do something with it, he decided to assert his right to remain silent, as we just discussed, correct? Right. He was familiar with the Fifth Amendment. He knew his rights, so to speak. And ultimately at his trial, because he was arrested ultimately, and he ended up going to trial, I believe it was a homicide case. When he was deciding whether or not to testify, he decided not to testify, okay? The prosecutor at the closing argument made note of the fact that when he went to go and speak with the police earlier on in the investigation, that when they asked him that question, he didn't answer. And all of a sudden he got silent when prior to that he was giving them all kinds of information, right? His lawyer objected like crazy. My client has a right to remain silent. He can't be, self-incriminating, and to comment on the fact that he didn't speak at that point is basically putting him in a position where he's incriminating himself by his own silence. Long story short of the matter is he was convicted. When the case went up on appeal and reached the Supreme Court, Justice Alito and the majority of the Supreme Court noted that actually he didn't have a right to remain silent at the time that he was speaking with the police because he wasn't in custody. Remember, he voluntarily went to go and speak with the police. And also, he wasn't being interrogated. He was being investigated. And most importantly, he did not invoke his right to remain silent. He didn't tell the police at that point that he decided to be silent. I'm being silent per my Fifth Amendment right. And because he didn't invoke it, because he didn't say why he was being silent, the Supreme Court decided at that point that his silence could be used against him. So it's very important when we're discussing this right to remain silent, if in fact you are approached by a police officer and they are asking you questions that you feel like could lead to you putting yourself in a position where you could be looked at as a suspect or anything along those lines, be clear that I'm asserting my Fifth Amendment right at this point, and I wish not to speak. No different than when you're watching congressional hearings and people are going and taking the Fifth. You have to do the same.
Great.
Right, and then you said something that's, I think, for the general public might seem a little bit convoluted, so if you can break it down a little bit more. But when you said being interrogated versus being investigated, because I think that most people would consider those to be the same thing.
That's like a huge distinction, but not to not answer your question, but probably the best thing to do is that when the police are questioning you and it's beyond them just asking for your name and your address and your age, say, I don't want to say anything without speaking without my lawyer present. There's no harm in you doing that. And that's the quickest and best way to protect yourself from anything else. It might seem like an extreme way to go, but it easily preserves your right against any kind of self-incrimination if you just say in the beginning, I don't want to answer any questions without my lawyer present. And it doesn't even matter if you didn't do anything wrong because it just protects your interests.
Right. But Asha, I guess on that point, let's say there's an officer, and I say that same thing to that law enforcement officer, and he or she says something like, well, if you don't say anything, I'm going to arrest you. What do you do at that point?
Get arrested and don't say anything without your lawyer, because the fact that the officer, in my opinion, has already said, if you don't say anything that I'm going to arrest you, that's coercive. And if it's your right to remain silent and an officer says that to you, you're already in a situation where you're at a disadvantage.
And when you say coercive, what do you mean?
Meaning forcing you to do something that you didn't want to do. In the situation that you gave, that person tried to invoke their Fifth Amendment right to remain silent, and they were faced with an officer that says, if you don't do this, I'm going to do that. Well, an officer is in a position of power. If an officer says that to you, I think a lot of times what happens is that people think they can talk their way out of things, and actually that hardly ever happens.
So it sounds like in this scenario, it seems like they're going to get arrested anyway.
We don't know, but we know that they're facing a dilemma, whereas the police are asking them to give information or talk about something they don't want to talk about. And it is inconvenient to be arrested. No one wants to be arrested. It's not going to be a fun process. But then neither is facing more serious charges against something when you could have just said, I don't want to speak to you without an attorney. So I realize that it sounds like far-fetched, and no one, it seems like that it's something that can't happen to you, but you just never know. And my opinion, based on the law and just based on my experience as a former public defender, is that it's just best if you feel that you're facing something that may incriminate you in any way, just your name, your address, and I want to speak to a lawyer. If you ask the officer, which is something that I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, am I free to leave? And the officer says no. If you're not free to leave, then you need your lawyer.
Right.
And I think to the extent that you're going to try to engage in a conversation with a police officer at this point, Asha, you bring up a great point. I think the start of that conversation, as it starts to go to a place that maybe you feel uncomfortable with, or you're starting to feel coerced, or you're starting to feel like you're going to be arrested, or just that something not positive is going to come of this interaction with the police officer, just ask the question. You have every right to do so. Am I free to leave? The officer at that point has to respond either in the affirmative or the negative. And to the extent that the officer tells you you're not free to leave, then for lack of a better way to put it, you know what it is. And at that point, that's a really good time to not try to talk yourself out of it, to not try to put yourself in a position where you're starting to tread within an area that you may not have full comfort. I'm an attorney, okay? And I've been doing this work for 10 years, both criminal defense and civil rights work. And even to the extent that those kind of interactions would ever happen to me, I'm not making any commentary to the police. I'm not trying to talk myself out of a situation, because once they let me know that I'm not free to leave, unfortunately at that point, I'm going to be arrested. I would rather than just deal with maneuvering that situation once I'm within the courts, once I'm dealing with my attorney. Rather than trying to talk myself out of something with the police, and my words could be turned and twisted and used in some kind of way to actually put me in more trouble, or to put me in trouble in the first place when I never even did anything. I mean, if that makes sense.
Right. And since we brought up attorneys, the right to counsel, what does that mean?
Well, the right to counsel, especially when you're facing criminal charges, that attaches to all citizens and also non-citizens. It attaches to anyone that's in custody. So if you are arrested for something and you're charged with a criminal offense, you have the right to an attorney. That's just, that you can't say it any more specifically than that. It's in black and white. You have a right for an attorney.
Right.
Sometimes people don't know that. If you're watching this show, you should know that, that you have a right for an attorney. Ask for one. Don't say anything without your attorney, and then when you face criminal charges, you have the right for an attorney. Right. It may be a while before you get one, depending on where you are and how long the process takes, depending where you live, but just wait and don't do anything without your attorney. But you have that right. That's guaranteed in the U.S. Constitution.
Yeah. So that actually seems like an important point to highlight. So when you're saying, and you have a right to an attorney, so we're not just saying American citizens, right? We're saying everyone.
Anyone that's arrested in the criminal justice system. I mean, we won't get into the other places where people face charges right now. That might be a different topic for a different show. But when you're facing criminal charges, yes, you do have a right to an attorney.
Right. And I think that's a good distinction, and you kind of just brought it up. Either when you're facing criminal charges, but it's not even necessarily when you are arrested that the right to counsel attaches. It kind of goes back to that legalese I was using earlier that we kind of had to break down, the custodial interrogation part of it, correct? And again, it's like, well, what's the difference between me being interrogated and me just going down to the precinct to speak with them because they left a card on my door and they wanted some information from me, right? I don't think we have enough time in this show to break down the case law to fully help everyone understand that, because even as lawyers, we're trying to figure out where's that fine line between an interview with the police and an interrogation. All of that being said, here's a great example, I think, to the extent that you've ever watched The First 48 or something along those lines. You see the person that's within the interrogation room speaking with the police officers. They may at that point not have been arrested, correct? But I think it's important for everyone to understand that the right to a counsel does actually at times attach before arrest. True. I think that example, like with The First 48, would be a great example. When those detectives start to kind of hone in on their suspect, they're trying to get him to the TV show. Right. They're trying to get them to admit to the homicide or admit that they had something to do with it or something along those lines. You see at times, and to the extent that you don't watch the show, I'm letting you know you have the right to ask for an attorney. Once you ask for an attorney, that ceases the interrogation. Once that right's invoked.
It's supposed to. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is supposed to. Right. And to the extent that you actually invoke that right, even if they do not stop interrogating, which they should, at that point, anything that you would say after you ask for an attorney could never be used against you. That's when we go back to the Fifth Amendment, your right to remain silent, and your right to, within the Sixth Amendment, have counsel.
One thing that I want to go back to, if someone is facing some kind of situation with police officers and they're not sure what to do, and stress does kind of hamper your response, people start to panic, try to remember details. Try to remember the names, the places, the officers' names, and what you said and what was done, because all of those details are important. It's a lot, when you're facing those situations. It's not going to be easy, but the more details that you have, the more that you can remember what happened when you were approached by the police officers and what happened after they started questioning you and what did you say and what did that officer say and when did you ask for an attorney. If you can remember those details, that's going to help your attorney and yourself a lot.
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Yeah, and actually, so that actually brings up an interesting thought. So I know a lot of times, let's say, I'm on the street and a police officer comes up to me and my friends, let's say. And let's say, just for the sake of argument, let's say I'm like 16 or 17, right? And for whatever reason, things escalate to a point where the officer is now trying to arrest my friends. I mean, let's say, and now today everyone's got a phone, everybody like tries to record things. Am I able to do that? Or when you're saying about, making sure that you have the badge information and all that, I mean, that seems like a lot of information. But let's say I think I just want to take my phone out and record it. Is that against the law, or is that something that I could do?
It's not against the law, but a person in that situation needs to try and look at all the factors that are surrounding him or her and figure out if it's safe, if they can do that safely, and can they leave the situation, can they ask, are they free to go? And if they're free to go, then the first thing that they need to do is document everything and call someone, call that person's parents, or try and find someone in the community that can help them. I don't know if, how many people are still going to churches, somebody in the community that can help. And just to get as many witnesses as possible and get the names of everything. I mean, that's a lot to do, and it's a responsibility that some people don't want to take. But if it was happening to you, wouldn't you want someone to do that?
Sure.
So I just kind of think that, unfortunately, it is something that you have to think about. Like having a plan A, like if this were to happen to me, and we talked about how the criminal justice system has impacted communities of color, and it's sad that we have to think that way, but we do. Like, we need to know what we need to do, what we can do, what we should do. And, everything is not going to be perfect. It's not going to be 100%. Everyone's not going to be able to do this. But if just one person hears this information and tells their friend, and they tell their friend, or just if they just sees this, so they can just put that in their mind. Because I think a lot of people watch television shows, and real life is much more scary than television. And also, television doesn't break down on like the little different steps that I don't think I've ever seen a television show where someone's being arrested where they said, I want to, see my lawyer. I don't want to say anything without talking to my lawyer, or am I free to leave, officer? I've never seen that. So, but that's the things that should be out there, not just people getting arrested.
Yeah, and even to pick up like where you started, with the question, Jason, more or less, I'm out and my friends are getting arrested. I mean, we see all the videos. You see them on the the social media sites. You see them on the news, what have you. How you kind of started your answer is exactly kind of the answer that you're looking for. You really have to kind of look at all of the circumstances, exercise judgment, and use common sense to the extent that you are that person who's going to record. You generally have that right to record. That's not in any way against the law. Good. However, the police have your friend up against the wall. They're trying to, effectuate the arrest or what have you. And then, like, you're going right up to the wall and putting your phone in the officer's face. That's a problem, because then at that point you could be arrested for obstructing governmental administration. If you want to stay back to the side, if you want to record the incident, sometimes you see these videos and you hear people saying, we're recording you, and kind of like escalating the situation in tone, kind of bringing like a lot of tension to the scene. That may not be the smartest thing to do, even if it's the legal thing to do. And that sometimes, unfortunately, is when you start to see situations get out of control that otherwise wouldn't have been, even for argument's sake, if the officer was wrong and didn't have the right to arrest your friend. As I said earlier, that will play itself out in court, right? The prosecutors, the judges, I do this. I'm seeing this in court. If there is no case there, if your friend was wrongfully arrested, the case will go away, all right? It's gonna go away one way or the other at some, course in the process, okay?
A long time.
And it could end up being a long time, but it will go away. I just don't think it's worth at that moment while your friend's getting arrested to try to, derail that process on the scene, because it could end up becoming a situation that gets escalated that could be dangerous for you, it could be dangerous for your friend, and it could be dangerous for any, the police officer, anyone else who is around and within that vicinity. I just don't think that's the right place to do it. So if you are going to record, you have that right to do so, but just use common sense as to what makes the most sense in that moment.
And I think that's actually a really good point that you bring up, because I think obviously in this day and age with social media, people are really concerned that their word is not going to be held as high as the police officer. Right. So a lot more people are using their phones. So for you all to give that advice is really helpful.
Right. But even if you don't have the phones, like I was saying before, trying to remember all the details, because that creates a timeline, that you can refer back to, or your attorney can refer back to. And yes, it is true that the officers' words are held in high esteem, but, citizens' words are held in high esteem too, because if you were the one observing something, what would be in it for you? I mean, it might be your friend, but what would be in it for you to make up something like that? So it is important to remember the details if you can. And if you have a camera or a phone, yes, you can take that. But like we were saying before, be smart. Now, obviously, everyone's not going to be able to remember all this and act accordingly in situations of high stress.
Right.
But just if you even have that in the back of your mind somewhere, like you've heard that information, that that there's another way for you to act in a situation where you're facing this, the information is there for you, just planting a seed. So maybe something that will stick, and that's all we can do.
Yeah. And it's actually, as we're thinking about it, this is a lot of information, obviously, and it takes time to be able to learn this and be good at it. It does make me think about something I was hearing about a little while ago, which was this bill, the Right to Know, to pass the Right to Know Act.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about that, or at least based on that, like what you need to know or what you're entitled to know during one of these circumstances?
Sure. I can take it from here. I guess in that sense, it kind of correlates with what I was saying earlier, just in the sense of like you having the right to, record the officer so long as you are not, putting the officer's safety at risk or in any way kind of, obstructing their, official duties. That being said, I know when I was, Ash and I were both public defenders actually in the Bronx. So I remember sometimes we would meet our clients in arraignments, which is, the period right before your first appearance in front of a judge, within 24 to 48 hours of an arrest. And, my clients would always say, Mr. Hamilton, they violated my rights. The officers violated my rights, by they arrested me or not reading me my rights, or they didn't give me this information. And, sometimes they would be right and sometimes they would be wrong. So kind of what I like about the Right to Know Act is that it puts together all of the actual rights that you do have in these police encounters, right? So for instance, to the extent that an officer is in a position where he has a founded suspicion of criminal activity happening, right? He's kind of looking at you and, he feels as though you might be up to something, for lack of a better way to put it. If that officer comes over to you and starts to kind of ask you about, what's going on over here? Why are you standing here late at night? Why are you standing by this car? Do you own this car? If you can kind of start to see where that conversation is going, you then have the right to ask that officer, well, let me take a step back. Who are you? Because some of the officers, you have to remember, they're in plain clothes. So think about like my car implication situation, right? That might be an undercover that's just kind of like working, car thefts or what have you. You're just standing by a car that may actually be your mom's car or your brother's car or something along those lines. To the extent that officer comes and asks you about that, they're not in uniform or what have you, you have the right to ask, well, who are you? And to the extent that you are an officer, can I please see a business card? And they have to give you one so that you at that point have an understanding that that's actually a police officer, right? That's one example, generally where you will have the right to ask for a card. When they're thinking that criminal activity is afoot, you have the right to know who they are. When we talk about, and I'm very thankful that we have seen a decrease in this over the years, but are you familiar with the stop and frisk?
Yes. Yeah, so we're going to have to get that for a minute, especially because we're already at a point where we only have about 3 minutes left.
Okay.
But I do want, at least before we finish up, I would like for us to end by discussing, let's say your rights were violated by an officer. Like, what should you do? What are the steps, in the last couple minutes we have that you should pursue?
When you say your rights are violated, are you talking about at the arrest? Are you talking about after the case is dismissed? Are you talking about?
So let's say you're incarcerated. You're with your lawyer. What do you do that point? Like what are the next steps?
If you're talking with your attorney, and this should be a conversation that you're having with her or him, you talk about what happened when you were arrested. What did the officer say or do? What did you say or do? And then talk about what happened when you got to the police precinct, and then perhaps what happened, if anything. Were there any more conversations between police officers between when you were arrested? You really have to have a conversation with your attorney about all the things that had happened, and even the smallest details that a person that's arrested might not think is important could be very well important and could turn the case on its head.
Okay,
All
so
right.
it looks like we're going to have to end it right there. But I also just want to mention that you can also bring a civil lawsuit sometimes. But that's all the time that we have for today. Dr. King once said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Hopefully today's discussion led to a little bit more justice out there. Thank you for watching Raising the Bar with the MBBA and the Manhattan Neighborhood Network. See you next time.